At the party for my son's adoption, my own mother raised her glass and told 50 guests he'd never really be ours. What my grandmother did next made her walk out of my house without another word. To Delia and Theo for doing such a generous thing for a little boy who needed somewhere to land. And let's all just hope that someday, when Milo goes looking for his real family, he remembers to thank the one that took him in. My mother delivered that line with her wine glass lifted to the exact height of a woman who thinks she's being kind, in my backyard, in front of 50 people, half of whom had watched me grow up. My son had been legally mine for 9 days. He was 4 years old. He was sitting in the grass in a bow tie he had insisted on, holding the paper crown my grandmother made him. And he looked up when he heard his name the way children do. Hopeful, waiting to find out if something good was about to happen. Nobody clinked a glass. My cousin Wren set hers down on the table so carefully it didn't make a sound, which was somehow louder than if she'd dropped it. A little girl by the dessert table stopped mid-reach for a cookie and looked at her mother to understand the weather. I felt the stem of my own glass go slick in my hand. And my grandmother, my 81-year-old grandmother, 4 feet 11 inches of retired seamstress in her good cardigan, a woman who spent the first 12 years of her life in 3 different foster homes and never once raised her voice in mine, did not stand up angry. She didn't argue. She smiled, actually, which should have been my mother's first warning. She set down her tea, walked to the sideboard, and picked up a worn leather book. What she did with that book took my mother apart so gently, so completely, that Lorna left my house without another word. Not one. She has not questioned whether Milo is family since. Not once. Not in over a year. Let me back up. Because to understand what was in that book and why it worked when 6 years of being reasonable never had, you need to understand how Milo came to be sitting in that grass in the first place. My name is Delia. I'm 33. I teach first grade, which means I spend my days at the exact height of 5-year-olds, tying shoes and settling arguments over who gets the blue chair, and my evenings peeling glitter off my hands. My husband, Theo, is a paramedic. He is the calmest person I have ever met. Professionally calm. The kind of calm you can only build by spending a decade arriving at the worst minute of strangers' lives and making it survivable. We married young. We wanted a house full of kids almost immediately. And for a long time, our house stayed quiet. If you've been through infertility, I don't have to describe it. If you haven't, here's the shape of it. 4 years of trying the ordinary way. Then the appointments, the beige waiting rooms, the folder that got thicker while my hope got thinner. 2 rounds of treatment we financed with a loan we told no one about. A pregnancy that lasted 9 weeks. Another that lasted 11, which is somehow worse because you let yourself buy one small thing. I cried in a lot of parked cars. The pharmacy on Beckett Road has the worst lot in the county. No shade, no privacy, just you and the steering wheel and a teenager gathering carts and pretending not to see. We stopped, and after we stopped, in the strange calm that comes after you put something down, we started the classes to become foster parents. Not as a consolation, as a door. Theo said one night, "There are already kids here who need what we've got," and that was that. Milo came to us on a Tuesday in March with everything he owned in a plastic grocery bag. He was 2.5. He did not cry, which our caseworker told us later was its own kind of red flag, a child who has already learned that crying doesn't bring anyone. He had a way of watching a room before he entered it. He flinched at raised voices and slept with his shoes on for the first 6 weeks. And the first time I found him standing by the front door at 5 a.m. with the grocery bag packed, ready to be moved again because that's all he'd ever known, I sat down on the floor of my own hallway and understood something about permanence that I have never been able to fully put into words. We were a foster placement. Then we were a pre-adoptive placement. Then, after a birth parent process I won't detail because it isn't mine to tell, and because it was genuinely sad for everyone, including people who deserve gentleness, we became the plan. It took, from that grocery bag to the judge's signature, almost 2 years. I told my grandmother the night Milo's room became officially his. She came over with a pie because she is incapable of arriving anywhere empty-handed, and she got down on the floor, which at her age is a whole production, and she took his small hand in both of hers and looked at it like it was a document, and she said 3 words, "You're home now." Milo, who by then had started to believe us in small increments, pressed his forehead against her shoulder. I had to leave the room. My grandfather, Ambrose, had died 4 years before, quietly, on an unremarkable Sunday, and since then, it had just been Opal in the little house full of his leatherwork, sewing for the church, keeping the family's calendar in her head. This boy was not just our second chance, he was hers. My mother had a different reaction. Let me introduce Lorna properly, because Lorna would insist on it. My mother is 59. For 26 years, she worked in the county records office, the last 9 of them running it, which is a detail that matters more than it sounds like it should. Lorna spent her whole career deciding what was official, what got entered, what was a real document, and what was just a piece of paper someone brought in. And when she retired, she did not stop. She simply turned the same machinery on us. She became the family genealogist, the keeper of the tree. 40 years deep, printouts and binders, and a DNA kit for every grandchild the week they were born. Her dining room wall is a framed chart the size of a garage door. She can tell you the maiden name of a woman who died in 1911. She is, in her own description, keeping our history safe, and she had been deciding who counted since the day I brought Milo home. It started small. the way it always does. At the first family dinner, she introduced him to a neighbor as the little one Delia's fostering, with a soft, meaningful landing on fostering, months after we'd told her he was the plan. When my sister-in-law's baby was born, Lorna showed up with a savings bond and a hand-embroidered pillow. When it was Milo's 3rd birthday, his first with us, she brought a gift bag with the receipt still in it and a card that said, "To our little guest." I told myself I'd misread it. I hadn't. Lorna does not misfile things. That is the entire point of Lorna. Here's what I noticed early, filed away, and talked myself out of for 2 years. She only did it about belonging. She would praise Milo's manners, his drawings, the way he'd started to laugh with his whole body. She wasn't cruel to his face in the ordinary sense. She was cruel about his place, about whether he had one. "He's a lovely boy," she'd say. And then, in the same breath, "You just never know with their backgrounds, do you?" She had DNA kits for the other grandchildren in a drawer, and no kit for Milo. And when Theo once asked her about it, gently she said, "Well, what would it tell us?" And let the sentence just sit there in the room. I built her a cathedral of excuses. She's from a different time. She lost her own father young and clung to knowing exactly where everyone came from because she'd felt what it was to lose the thread. She worked her whole life in a place where a thing was real only if there was paper for it. And now a child had walked into her family without the paper she trusted, and she didn't know how to file him. All of that is even true. But I want to tell you something I learned the hard way, and I wish someone had told me at the start. An explanation for cruelty is not a permission slip for it. I let hers function like one for 2 years. And here's the mechanism, in case you have a Lorna of your own. She handed out her doubts in private, one soft poison drop at a time, and she collected her sympathy in public, by the bucket. Every cut was deniable. She never said Milo isn't family. She said things like, "I just don't want you crushed if it doesn't work out," about a boy who was already, legally, halfway ours. And the one time Theo named it out loud at a dinner, said plainly, "Lorna, you treat him like a house guest," she did the thing. Her chin trembled. Her hand went to her collarbone. She became, in 4 seconds, the wounded party. And by dessert, her sister Sandra was texting me that my mother had cried the whole drive home and only ever tried to love this family. And how could Theo be so harsh? The cruelty was retail, one small transaction at a time. The fragility was wholesale. That's how you end up apologizing to the person who hurt your child. But denial has a shelf life, and mine ran out on an ordinary Thursday, when I caught myself doing something that scared me. Lorna was coming for dinner. And at 4 in the afternoon, I found myself in Milo's room, and I had taken his framed adoption day photo, the one Theo and I loved, off the little shelf by his bed, and I was holding it. And I realized I was deciding whether to put it back up before she arrived. I was hiding evidence of my own son's belonging in his own room so that my mother would have less to poke at. And it got worse because I looked down and saw, in the corner of the closet, the plastic grocery bag. I'd kept it. 2 years in, I'd kept the bag he arrived with, folded, on a shelf, and some back room of my brain had been quietly keeping it packable, just in case. I had been holding my own child at exactly the distance my mother held him, so that if she turned out to be right, it would hurt a measured amount. I sat down on his floor for the 2nd time in his life, and I could not get a full breath. I told Theo that night, all of it. The photo, the bag, the arithmetic I'd apparently been running without permission from myself. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's not caution anymore. That's her voice coming out of your hands." And then he said the thing I'd been most afraid of. "She's not just hurting us, she's teaching him." That's the thing that changed everything. It stopped being about my feelings and started being about a 4-year-old learning, in real time, from the woman who framed our whole family's history, that he was provisional. I want to tell you about the 2 people who armored me because it matters to what came later. The first was our caseworker, Renee Alcott, 11 years on the job, who had walked more kids across more thresholds than she could count. When I finally admitted to her, ashamed, that I still had the grocery bag, she didn't flinch. She said, "You can throw it out or you can frame it, but you can't keep it packable. Kids can feel a packed bag through a closet door." The second was Dr. Paloma Reyes, a child psychologist who specialized in adoption and attachment, whom we started seeing not because Milo was broken, but because we wanted to not break him. She said one thing in our 3rd session that I typed into my phone in the parking lot so I'd have it word for word. "A child cannot build a self on ground someone keeps threatening to pull up. Your only job is to be the ground. You are not required to be the weather too, and you are not required to let anyone else be." And when I told her that my own mother was the weather, she said simply, "Then your mother doesn't get a vote on the ground." Armed with that, I tried the reasonable thing, the naive thing. At the next family lunch, when Lorna made one of her soft comments about Milo's background, I said brightly, using the actual language of the actual court, "The adoption's finalizing next month, Mom. The judge said he's as much ours as any child born to us. It's completely legal." And Lorna smiled at me with real terrible pity, patted my hand and said, "Legal, sweetheart, I spent 30 years watching people wave papers at me. Paper isn't the same as it being true. 30 years of vital records, deployed against my son over a chicken salad." And that was the moment I understood. No document I could carry into her house would ever outrank her. Evidence wasn't the currency with Lorna. I just didn't know yet what was. My grandmother knew. Opal had known for a long time. But my grandmother plays a very, very long game. Opal was the one who suggested the party. Not a shower, we'd said no to a shower years ago when it hurt too much, but a party for the day the adoption became final. A child should be celebrated where he lives, she said, with everyone who's going to be around him watching them do it. She wanted it at our house. She planned it herself, mostly, from her little kitchen table with a legal pad, at 81, with lists in her careful seamstress hand. She strung the backyard with paper lanterns. She sewed Milo a small cape because he'd mentioned once, exactly once, that he liked capes. She made a crown out of gold cardstock and felt. And 3 weeks before the party, she sent something to every single guest. I only found out because I'm nosy, and she leaves her legal pad in plain sight. It was an email, and for the older relatives, a card in the mail, and it said in her words, "We are welcoming Milo into the family, officially, the way our family has always done it. Before the party, please think of one thing you want him to know he can count on from you. A promise. A memory you plan to make with him. A thing you'll teach him. You'll add it in person. Don't tell Delia." Every guest got that message. Every single one. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters later. What I did not know about was the book. I saw it for the first time the morning of the party, sitting on the sideboard where my grandmother had set it, and I actually stopped in the doorway. It was old, leather, hand-stitched, the cover worn soft and dark at the corners, the way only decades of hands can wear a thing. When I asked, Opal flapped a dish towel at me and said, later, in the exact voice she'd used my whole life to guard cooling pies. I found out later, that same night, what it was. My grandfather made it. Ambrose was a leather worker, and he made that book for Opal the first year they were married, because of who Opal was. My grandmother, you have to understand, has no idea who she is related to by blood. She was left at a church as an infant and moved between foster homes until she aged out, and she married my grandfather at 19, having never in her life met a single person she shared blood with. Ambrose made her a book so that she would never again be a person with no one written down, and Opal filled it. Not with a bloodline, she didn't have one, but with everyone she chose and everyone who chose her. On the day you joined the family, by birth, by marriage, by any road at all, Opal pressed your hand onto a page and wrote your name and the date beneath it, and one of the elders wrote you a single line, a promise. My handprint is in there from the day I was born. Theo's is in there from our wedding. 60 years of hands. The whole reason my mother grew up worshipping bloodlines is that she was raised by a woman who never had one, and built a family out of nothing but the deciding. I didn't know all that yet on the morning of the party. What I knew was that my grandmother was in my backyard at 8 in the morning, arguing gently with a folding table, and that Milo, who had recently discovered the word actually and deployed it constantly, followed her around holding the box of lanterns and narrating. At one point, she knelt down and showed him the book, and I watched from the window as she opened it to a page near the back and let him look, and I saw his whole small face change, and I didn't know why until later, because that page already had his handprint on it. She'd done it weeks before, the size of his 4-year-old hand pressed in soft gray ink, his name beneath it in her careful hand, and the date, Milo, the day we made it true. She'd entered him before anyone could vote on it. The party was, for most of an afternoon, exactly what it was supposed to be. 60 people who loved us. My cousin Ren ran the games. My Uncle Boone, who is 88 and holds a beer like it owes him money, told the same 3 stories he always tells. A little girl named Pearl, who is 7 and takes any assigned duty with the seriousness of a federal judge, appointed herself guardian of the gift table. Milo wore the cape and the crown, and for the first time since I'd known him, walked into the middle of a crowded space instead of watching it from the edge, and I had to keep finding reasons to go inside so no one would see my face. Lorna arrived 20 minutes late, which for my mother is a form of punctuation. She scanned the yard, the lanterns, the little cape, with the expression of a woman doing an audit. Opal certainly went to a lot of trouble, she said, which in Lorna means expense. That wasn't hers to approve. Then she found me. He looks happy, she said, and I let myself have half a second of hope before she landed it. Enjoy this part. It's when they get older and start asking questions that it gets complicated. Theo, beside me, went still. And that's when my grandmother, carrying a pitcher of lemonade, passed behind my mother without slowing down and said, pleasantly, to the air, "You'd know all about complicated questions, Lorna. You've just never once liked the answers," and kept walking. My mother's mouth opened, found nothing on file, and closed. Ren made a sound into her cup. For 2 hours it held. There were mini rewards, if you want to call them that. When Lorna remarked that Milo was certainly comfortable helping himself at the food table, I used the flat, pleasant tone Dr. Reyes had taught me, said, "He is. Isn't it wonderful?" and turned back to my aunt, ending it, not winning it. When Lorna mentioned to a cluster of cousins that she was still deciding how to represent Milo on the family chart, Theo appeared at her elbow with a plate and said, "Center of the page works," and handed her a deviled egg and walked off. Boone laughed so hard he had to sit down. I should have known she was saving her real work for the moment there'd be the most witnesses. Deniability needs an audience. I'd been treating her comments as leaks. They were rehearsals. At sunset, when the lanterns came on and the whole yard went gold, my grandmother tapped her tea glass with a spoon and the tables quieted, and she said, "Before we lose the light, let's say a few words for Delia, Theo, and Milo." My mother stood before Opal had finished the sentence. Her chair scraped the patio stones, that long, ugly sound, and 60 faces turned. "I'll start," she said, and lifted her glass into the gold light. "To Delia and Theo, what you've done is genuinely generous. Not everyone would take in a child who isn't their own." A ripple went through the seats. Not laughter, the other thing. And then she looked right at me and her voice went up half a step, bright and carrying. A voice trained by 30 years of telling people at a counter that their paperwork wasn't in order. "And let's just hope that someday when Milo goes looking for his real family, he remembers to thank the one that took him in." Nobody clinked a glass. The silence had a texture. Pearl, 7 years old, stopped with a cookie halfway to her mouth and looked at her mother to find out what was happening. My cousin set her glass down without a sound. And Lorna, reading the quiet as suspense instead of horror, went in for the second one, the way she always did, one cut never being enough. "You can give a child your name," she said, warm as anything. "You just can't give him your blood. But a name's a nice thing to give." The whole yard stopped, and I looked at Milo, who had heard the phrase, real family, and looking for, and was doing the thing he does, watching the adults to find out if he was still safe, one hand drifting to the hem of his cape. And I had exactly one clear thought cut through the roar in my ears. He will not learn this at his own party. Not from her. Not today. Theo stood up so fast, his chair went over into the grass. "That's enough." "It was a toast," Lorna said, the injury already loading behind her eyes, her chin beginning its practiced tremble. Sandra was half out of her seat. In 4 seconds, my mother would be the wounded one. The party would become the day Theo shouted at his mother-in-law. The whole thing would be laundered into her version by the next holiday. And my grandmother touched Theo's arm. "I'll handle this," she said. She didn't go toward my mother. That was the first strange thing, the thing that made the whole garden lean in without moving. She walked away from Lorna to the sideboard, and she came back carrying the leather book, and she set it on the head table where everyone could see it. And she opened it. "We have one more thing to do," she said, in the voice 80 years of choosing a family gives you, a voice that fills a space without pushing on it. "In our family, when someone joins us, we don't wait to see if it takes. We write them in. My husband made this book for me when I was 19 because I came into this world with no one written down anywhere, and I decided that would never happen to another soul I loved." She turned the pages, and even from where I stood, I could see them, hand after hand after hand, decades of gray and blue ink. "Every person at this table is in here. Delia, the day she was born. Theo, the day he married her." She stopped near the back and turned the book around so the yard could see, and there it was, the small gray print of a 4-year-old hand. "And Milo, 3 weeks ago, because I don't need to wait and find out if he's ours. I already know." Then she said the thing that made it land. "I asked every one of you, before today, to think of one promise for him, a thing he can count on from you. You're going to come up one at a time, and I'm going to write it in under your name, so that when this boy is grown and reads this book, he'll know exactly who was standing here the day we made it true, and what they swore to him." And they came. Boone first, who said, gruff, "Fishing, the real kind, not the phone kind." And the yard laughed, the warmth rushing back into the whole garden all at once, everywhere except one chair. Pearl announced that her promise was cookies and telling him which grown-ups are lying, which got the biggest laugh of the night. Ren, my aunt, Theo's brother, one after another, 60 people speaking a single sentence into a book, and my grandmother writing each one in her careful hand, and I stood there with my hand over my mouth watching my son's face understand, in real time, the exact opposite of what my mother had tried to teach him. And when the last guest sat down, my grandmother turned to the one line she had left blank. She looked at it, and then she looked up, and she picked up the pen, and she carried it and the open book across the patio, unhurried, and she set them down on the table directly in front of Lorna, squared up like a place setting. "I saved this line for you," Opal said. My mother stared at the book. "I didn't know about this. I sent you the same message I sent everyone," my grandmother said, 3 weeks ago. And she was right, and everyone knew she was right, because 3 weeks ago my mother had replied to that group message, Ren showed me later, with a single line. "Are we sure we want him in the actual book? Or is there a separate page for situations like this?" She'd read it. She'd read all of it, and she'd asked for a separate page. Nobody said any of that out loud. My grandmother didn't have to. That's the thing I keep learning from Opal. You don't have to prosecute people who file the confession themselves. The yard was silent. Even the children were silent, the way children go quiet when they can feel the weather change. "You can write it right now," my grandmother said, and clicked the pen once and held it out. "You don't even have to read it out loud. Just one promise. One thing he can count on from you." Lorna gave a thin little laugh and looked around the tables for an ally and found 60 patient, waiting faces, and not one of them coming. And then my grandmother leaned in, just slightly, just enough, and her voice went soft, soft like a lullaby. Soft the way you talk to a room full of children you need to settle. Soft in the way that has nothing left to prove and nowhere to be, and is therefore completely impossible to escape. "When Milo is grown," she said, "and he reads every name in this book, Lorna, and he will, what do you want him to find written beside yours?" My mother looked at the book. She looked at the pen. She looked once, quickly, at the faces around the tables, at Boone, who gazed placidly back, at Sandra, who had found something interesting on her own hands, at Theo, who did not move, At me, at Milo in his cape, with the crown slipping over one ear, watching, learning. She reached out and took the pen. For 1 second, I actually believed she would sit down and write, and I don't know what I felt about that. Hope, maybe. The stubborn weed that it is. She set the pen down on the open page, very carefully, so it wouldn't roll. Then she gathered her purse from the back of her chair, and she stood, and she walked across my patio, and out through the side gate, her heels leaving small holes in my lawn, past the lanterns, and she did not say a single word. Not to Theo, not to me, not to her own mother standing there holding the pen, not to the 60 people, and not to the boy in the paper crown who was the only one at that whole party she'd been asked to make a promise to. Nobody chased her. My grandmother picked the pen back up. She looked at the blank line for a moment, then she closed the book. Gently, and she set it down on the table beside Milo, and she pulled him up into her lap, and she opened it to his page, to the small gray hand and the date beneath it, and she pressed her finger under the words she'd written there weeks before, and she read them to him, quietly, just for him. The same 3 words she'd said the night his room became his. "You're home now." He put his forehead against her shoulder, and the lanterns came on the rest of the way, and somebody refilled the lemonade, and the party went on without the one person who had never once been willing to write him in.